Welcome all to the last RICOMET session. I hand over to the moderator of this session, José Luis Gutiérrez Villanueva.
Hello, hello, Mary. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, good afternoon or good evening, good morning. It depends from where you are connecting, because we have a huge amount of participants today, almost 170 participants from all over the world, not only from Europe, but yeah, for many other countries as well. First of all, I would like to say a few words, and just to say thank you to the organizers of RICOMET, to Tanya, to Mary, who has the probably a very hard job today to be on the background, making that everything works properly. So thank you, Mary. This is quite impressive. And yeah, and thank you also for the opportunity to chair this session about the implementation of legal requirements regarding radon and workplaces. So thank you very much and welcome to all participants. When it comes to legal requirements, so we are always thinking on regulations or recommendations that come from institutions such as the European Union or International Atomic Energy Agency. But there are also many countries in the world and in Europe that have their own national legislations, and they aim to protect workers from dangers coming from ionizing radiation and in particular radon gas exposure. Today's session, we are going to focus mainly on the social implications of these implementations. So not too much technical things today, but societal aspects. For instance, we will try to address some questions that everybody can ask. So how are the countries doing these implementations, which is especially important in Europe? In Europe, we have the European directive, Euratom Basic Safety Standards. And now, after 2018, all the EU member states have to implement this document into the national legislations. But how is it going? How to do that? Have all the countries do the job? Maybe not, maybe yes. So we will try to answer these questions. Also, a very important question. We have a lot of regulations, a lot of norms, but all these documents are good enough to ensure the safety at the workplaces in terms of protection against radon exposure. For sure, I am pretty sure all our speakers today will try to address these points and will try to give answers, but we will have, of course, more questions. I would like to introduce you to the speakers. It's an excellent pool of speakers today. So we have Olga German from the International Atomic Energy Agency. We have Tasos from International Labour Organization, Katerina Rovenska from the Czech Republic, Caroline Shiver from France, and Rosabianca Tribisi from Italy. As I said before, we have a lot of registrations, 170, probably more participants from all over the world. And they include people from regulatory agencies, researchers, universities, companies, many people. Just to finish this introduction, a couple of technical questions. Each speaker will have 12 minutes for the presentation. And after that, we will have 5 minutes at the end of every presentation for questions and answers. So, and the session will be recorded. So let's start with the first speaker, Olga German from the International Atomic Energy Agency will present about the legal requirements for the protection of workers in existing exposure situations. So, Olga, the floor is yours.
I will share. Olga is in a really nice place. So she has connection problems, so I will share her video now.
Good time of the day, everyone. Welcome to this conference. My name is Olga German from the Radiation Protection Unit of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And today I will briefly run through the requirements for the protection of workers against exposure to radon for you. To begin with, I would like to remind you that general principles for radiation protection, independent of the source of radiation. The protection has to be implemented, and it doesn't matter which type of exposure situation we are talking about. Justification of exposure and practice has to be applied. The protection has to be optimized. There should be some sort of limitation of exposure. It could be a reference level or dose limit. There are always defined responsibilities of governments, of regulatory body or other competent authorities. There are always requirements on measurements and record keeping. The responsibilities of employers and licensees have to be defined, and specific requirements on service providers and their services have to be in the system. Here we can see a couple of examples, but of course it's not a rule, for the workplaces where radon exposure could be significant. And the important one is to keep in mind that this could be the case, but not necessary, and there could be other workplaces where radon could be significantly increased. To remind you briefly about the definitions, we are talking about reference levels when we are in existing exposure situation. We are talking about dose limits when we are in planned exposure situations. And many times we talk about regulatory body, but when it comes to naturally occurring radioactive materials, we also talk about other competent authorities. And these competent authorities could be Radiation Protection Authority, it could be Public Health Authority, Worker Safety Authority, Building Safety Authority, etc. Important that they have responsibilities in relation to radon. And the basic safety standards of the IAEA is divided into 3 categories of exposure, and radon comes in existing exposure situation and in planned exposure situations. And for existing exposure situation, the requirement says that the regulatory body shall establish and enforce requirements for protection of workers in existing exposure situations and set a reference level of not exceeding 1000 becquerel per cubic meter. And if after all remedial and corrective actions, the reference level, the measured radon activity remains above the reference level, the requirements of planned exposure situation shall apply. In planned exposure situation, we are now talking about monitoring and record of exposures. We are talking about dose limit, 20 millisievert per year. We are talking about classification of work areas, local rules and personal protective equipment, monitoring of workplaces, assessment of occupational exposure, health surveillance, information, instruction, training, conditions of service, special arrangements for different specific categories of workers. So it becomes more complicated. And the basic approach to the logic of how to define whether the workplace falls under the planned exposure category or existing exposure category workplace is presented here. There are many different ways of identifying workplaces. You can set them, if you know, in your National Radon Action Plan. You can order measurement at all workplaces in your country. You can pay specific attention to workplaces where you know radon can be elevated. You measure, or you require the measurement if you're a regulatory body, or you measure if you're an employer. If you're above the reference level, you have to remediate, to implement corrective actions, verify your measurements. If you fall below the national reference level after corrective actions, you remain in existing exposure situation, and what is required that you repeat your measurements periodically If you are above the reference level, you have to notify the authority and you have to assess exposure, and further details follow. In general, the responsibilities of regulatory body or other competent authorities is to set the requirements on where to measure, how to measure, what is the maximum allowed level, how to verify the compliance, establish notification and reporting system, requirements on what is to be notified, require protection and optimization of protection, and specify means of enforcement of the requirements. Without this, the requirements will not be observed if there is no means of enforcement. For the planned exposure situation, there are more requirements, and specific requirements are enforced in, for example, service providers and record keeping of occupational exposure. For example, service providers have to demonstrate competence on radon. The responsibility for the radiation protection officer for radon protection is a little bit different from the radiation protection officer in general. Competences of radiation protection officer for radon protection need to be specified or defined. We need specific requirements for radon dosimetry in the system. We need special definitions of what is radon area compared to, in the radiological protection, we talk about supervised area and surveillance area, but now for radon we have to define this somehow differently. Measures for protection of workers and of the optimization of protection of workers have to be required. Here are some examples of what can be required for the approval of measurement methods and what could be required for approval of service providers. And for the measurements, it's a usual that the measurement is either approved by regulatory body and designed by regulatory body, or it could be designed by a service provider and then agreed with the regulatory body. And there's certain minimum requirements what such measurement method could include. Also, if there is a need in planned exposure situation to make dose assessment for exposure to radon, it should be clearly specified which dose conversion factors should be used, which assumptions need to be recorded, how dose assessment is recorded, whether it is dose assessment or exposure assessment that is recorded, etc. When we talk about approval of service providers, it should be specified whether laboratories are approved based on accreditation or they are approved based on the minimum requirements by regulatory body, or could be both. And then, of course, minimum requirements on measurement protocols, on quality assurance, on the competence of staff has to be defined. Radiation protection program in case the workplace is above the reference level need to be developed, and the requirements for a radiation protection program could be, of course, applied using graded approach depending on the type of workplace, and the regulatory body has to specify what is required in radiation protection program when radon exceeds the reference level. So what is my workplace above the reference level? What do I do? This is what we say, that if despite all corrective measures you are still above the reference level, specific requirements of planned exposure situation applies. And these requirements are as follows. You have to notify the regulatory body. You have to provide specific information required in the regulatory documents, what to notify about. Usually it's what is the measurement, which correction actions have been implemented, and what is the verification measurement after correction, and plus some legal information on the workplace. But this has to be defined, of course. And of course, we recommend that the graded approach is used if you have a workplace where radon is the only source of exposure. Use the graded approach, use the requirements that are commensurate to the risks of exposure. And for example, as an example of application of graded approach, the regulatory body could require dose assessment or could require only exposure assessment, etc. So don't forget that there is a means to reduce the burden on the employer. Another example of graded approach is to simplify the radiation protection program for workplaces where radon is the only source of exposure, and what could be mandatory or what could be considered as required for radiation protection program is listed on this table. So to conclude my long speech, I would like to remind you that the workplace could fall under existing exposure situation, under planned exposure situation, or a situation where radon is the only source of exposure, but it is above the reference level, and different regulatory requirements would apply accordingly. So if you would like to have more information, here are the requirements of IAEA. The guidance how to implement the requirements are available, and some technical reports and safety reports are available to support you in your work. So thank you for your attention. That was all for me for today.
So thank you very much, Olga, for your recorded video exactly on time. So thank you very much. We appreciate that. And now we have 5 minutes for the participants to raise questions to Olga. I think Olga is online. Hi, Olga. Hi.
Hi,
so
I'm here.
yeah, so we have 5 minutes for questions from the participants. I cannot see any question yet, but if you don't mind, Olga, I have some questions, so I can break the ice a little bit to provoke participants to ask questions. One important thing that you mentioned is that responsibilities. So the national bodies, they have responsibilities to verify that the radiation protection program, the radon reference levels are respected. Yeah, I mean, IAEA cannot enforce that, but you provide a lot of advice and you have a lot of experience. So do you have any experience of some enforcement actions in some countries when the levels are not respected? So if there is a way to, I don't know, set up fines to workplaces that don't pay attention to the national regulations. I don't know if you have some experience about that.
Yeah, it's an important question, and I think that most countries do have, at the end of each regulation, and especially at the end of the national laws, there are always paragraphs saying if you don't comply to paragraph this and this of this law, the fine is 2 years of imprisonment. And the license withdrawal and everything to 6 months salary or income of the company. That's usually how it is applied. The income of the company is withdrawn. The worst cases for non-compliance with certain regulations could be the individual responsibility of employers. And I think it is something that is in the most of the labor protection acts. I think Tasos can add on that when he speaks. So there are always some sort of enforcement rules for non-compliance with the regulations, but there is nothing in the IAEA standards. We don't recommend any special levels of enforcement.
Okay, okay, but it's good to know that there are experience in some places about that. We have now questions from the participants. Yeah, maybe two questions. I will start with Sebastian Feige from BFS. So he's asking about the status of the IAEA standard protection of workers from radon.
This is not a standard. This is a safety guide to support the basic safety standards. It is under development, and it is actually available. The draft is available on the RASC website of the IAEA, but it is not finished. The work is not finished yet, but it's under development, and hopefully in next year we can go for publication.
Okay. Okay, good. Yeah, we don't have more questions now from participants. Just very briefly, Olga, if you can comment something regarding doses. So I always ask the same question wherever I go. We are always thinking on this, let's say, magic number of 20 millisievert per year. But as soon as those conversion factors change, this level can be reached depending on the, different radon concentrations can give the same reference, the same limit if we change the conversion factors. Do you have any opinion on that? If the limit should be also considered maybe at the same time as we change those conversion factors, or?
There is no discussion about changing the limit to allow anymore. The discussion that we are currently having with the member states of the IAEA is how to deal with when you have a planned exposure situation and you have radon exposure of these people. It might still be below the reference level of 1000 becquerel, but for many workers, for example, a radiographer, at the moment, we only record the dose from the radiographer source to the radiographer working with non-destructive testing. But many times these people work in tunnels and are exposed to high levels of radiation, might be below reference level, but still 600 becquerel is already about 13, 14 millisievert. And the only dose that is currently recorded is the 1 millisievert from the radiographer source. And the question is, should we consider these doses even if they are below the reference level and record them and implement the optimization of protection, or should we ignore these doses? I know that at the moment we do not record, but is it ethical to ignore them? Is it allowed to ignore them? That's an important question we have to discuss before we finalize our safety guide on radon at workplaces. How to deal when radon is below the reference level, but still, due to high dose conversion factors, significant levels. Okay,
thank you very much, Olga. And keep online. Maybe we will have more time at the end of the webinar.
Sure, I'm with you.
Okay, enjoy the place where you are. So the next speaker will be Tasos from International Labour Organization. He will deliver a presentation about the instruments that this organization has on the protection of workers to radon. So Tasos, the floor is yours, and you have 12 minutes for your presentation.
12 minutes and counting. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I will see if I can share my screen and show you my presentation. Let's see. Is that okay?
You have to go to display settings.
Again? Yes. Okay, I'll do that again.
Yes. Display settings and...
There it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if we can see you, turn on your camera and that would be great. Not asking any more things.
Sorry, you can see me or you can see the presentation?
We can see the presentation, we cannot see you.
That's okay. It's important to see the presentation just in case the internet causes any problems.
Okay.
So let's start then. I have wasted the first minute. Hi, everybody. I will give you a brief introduction on the work of the International Labour Organization and the activities that it carries out, which includes worker protection. As you probably know, the ILO is a United Nations agency. The aims of the ILO is to advance social and economic justice through setting international labor standards. It was founded in October 1919, a long time ago, under the League of Nations, and it is the first and oldest specialized agency of the United Nations. Within the UN system, the ILO has a unique tripartite structure. All standards, policies, and programs require discussion and approval from the representatives of governments, employers, and workers. As you know already, my name is Tasos Zodiates, and I am giving this presentation on behalf of Dr. Shengli Niu, who is unable to be here today. Myself, I work in the nuclear power industry in radiation protection and radiological analysis. But I am also a trade union representative, and in this dual capacity, I represent the workers in the ILO's work on radiation protection. This presentation will give you an overview of the basis of the ILO's work on the protection of workers. I think I am at the right place now. There are a number of occupational risk factors that need to be addressed at the workplace, such as chemical risk factors, biological agents, physical factors, adverse ergonomic conditions, radiation hazards, and many others. The risk factors can lead to injuries or diseases, and this is what we are trying to protect against. Looking at the case of a mine, for example, injuries can result from mechanical or electrical accidents. Occupational diseases can result from dust, vibrations, noise, and other factors. However, there are some risk factors that can result in both injuries or diseases. The United Nations has identified 17 Sustainable Development Goals that you can see in this slide. Goal number 8 is decent work and economic growth. This goal, decent work and economic growth, has 12 targets in total. Target 8 is to protect labor rights and promote safe and secure working environments for all workers, including migrant workers, and in particular, women migrants and those in precarious employment. The work that the ILO carries out is usually discussed and approved at the assembly of the ILO. And there has been a recent international labor conference which has dealt with the future of work in particular. Within Target 8, and appropriate to this meeting, is the requirement that specifies that safe and healthy working conditions are fundamental to decent work. This is pertinent to us because it also encompasses protection from radon. The ILO policy on working conditions requires safe and healthy working environments, working conditions that are consistent with workers' well-being and dignity, work that offers personal achievement, self-fulfillment, and service to the society. Relevant ILO conventions and recommendations contain the following basic principles for occupational safety and health. The responsibilities of the employer towards the health and safety of the workers in their employment, the role of the competent authority in setting national policy, regulation, inspection, enforcement, and workers have the rights to be kept safe, but also a responsibility in following the appropriate safety arrangements. There is a hierarchy of preventive measures which in Convention 148 from 1977 were specified as technical measures, organizational measures, personal protective equipment. More recently, in Convention 176 from 1995, these have been defined in terms of elimination of risks, control measures and minimization of risks, and personal protective equipment. In taking preventive and protective measures under this part of the Convention, the employer shall assess the risk and deal with it in the following order of priority. The first aim is to eliminate the risk. If the risk cannot be eliminated, then aim to control the risk at source. And thereafter, minimize the risk by means that include, for example, the design of safe work systems. And insofar as any risk remains, provides for the use of personal protective equipment. These are to be implemented having regard to what is reasonable, practicable and feasible, good practice, and the exercise of due diligence. The ILO standard for protection of workers from radiation is embodied in Convention 115. ILO standards exert considerable influence on the laws and regulations of member states. Many texts have been modeled on the relevant provisions of ILO instruments. Drafts of new legislations or amendments are often prepared with ILO standards in mind, so as to ensure compliance with ratified conventions or to permit the ratification of conventions. Trade unions use ILO standards to support arguments in safety, bargaining, and in promoting legislation. Governments frequently consult the ILO, both formally and informally, about with international labor standards. To this date, 50 countries have ratified the convention. Convention 115 applies to all activities involving exposure of workers to ionizing radiations in the course of their work. Therefore, it also applies to workers who are exposed to radon in the course of their work. Convention 115 aims to ensure effective protection of workers and requires that all appropriate steps be taken in the light of knowledge available at the time. And our understanding of radon has been developing for quite a few years now. It identifies the need for dose limits, but also the need to keep those limits under constant review in the light of current knowledge. The ILO cooperates very closely with the other UN bodies to develop radiation protection standards. The principal document that is setting standards for radiation protection and the safety of radiation sources is the International Basic Safety Standards, which was issued by the IAEA. I will refer to it as the agency, and jointly sponsored by many UN and other international organizations, including the ILO. The ILO also provides practical guidance in the form of codes of practice or guidelines. A major ILO contribution to the international fight against diseases caused by work is its list of occupational diseases adopted in 2010. This is the most authoritative international list of occupational diseases and created a new history by specifying at the international level those mental and behavioral disorders caused by work as occupational diseases. The following slides provide a few examples of the work that the ILO does. It issues documents relating to worker protection, whether it's reporting of accidents and diseases or protection of personal data. There is a suite of documents that cover radiation protection standards, like the PSS, but also provide guidance on how to implement the standards. Radiation protection safety guides are issued by the agency, but are developed and co-sponsored by the ILO as well as other organizations. In addition to the development of standards and guidance, the ILO is involved in promoting the implementation of the radiation protection safety standards. This is done by providing training to different regions and countries, both regulators, and also employers. This work is usually done in cooperation with the agency. The ILO is an active member of two of the agency's safety committees where international standards are developed. These are the Radiation Safety and the Emergency and Preparedness Standards Committees. Myself, I support the ILO as the workers' representative in the Radiation Safety Standards Committee, as well as participating in many of the training workshops on behalf of the ILO. You can find a lot of useful information on general occupational health and safety on the ILO website. And finally, this slide summarizes the relevant activities of the ILO in the area of radiation protection, such as promoting radiation safety through Convention 115, the involvement of workers and employers' organizations in setting standards, participating in international committees, collaborating with the IAEA in its development and promotion of the BSS and safety guides, participating in conferences, meetings, and workshops, and also participating in technical missions to promote the safety standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tasos. Was a very nice presentation. In our Radon events, it's not common to have people representing ILO. So thank you very much for coming today. Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions before the next speaker. So I invite participants to add your questions to the chat or the QA button. But meanwhile, I have a question for you, Tasos. Yeah, a question or a comment. I would like to know your opinion about, yeah, well, first of all, I am quite surprised that only 50 countries have ratified so far the Convention 115. I don't know if there is any reason for most of the countries avoid this ratification or not, but the question is more connecting with the communication. So are there any experience or ILO has any aims at trying to convince the employers and also the workers that it is also very important to control the radon exposure at home, not only at work? At home is more on a voluntary basis. If you want to do it, it is much easier to regulate at workplaces. But most of us spend most of our time at home. So do you have any comment on that or any experience on this type of communication channels with the workplaces?
In general, in terms of the ILO work, the remit, at least in the area where I am working, is for workers' protection. And a lot of it is actually providing education and training to workers on the basis that when workers understand the hazards and the means for improving safety, it's more likely that those will be implemented. We do not, the ILO does not have a remit in terms of public protection. However, by training and providing that knowledge to workers, like electrical safety, for example, is not something you only do at the workplace, you do at the home as well. And therefore, by promoting understanding of the radon hazards, we kind of hope that workers will take that knowledge and apply it at the home as well.
Yeah, this connects a little bit with another question that comes from the participants. Lyudmila is commenting about the psychological effects of workers, especially minors also. And we have, you can comment on that, Tasos. And one more thing comes from Emily from WHO saying, does ILO have any activities related to workers in informal mining situations? So you can answer very briefly these two questions and we will continue with the next speaker.
Obviously, in terms of worker protection, all manifestations of injuries or diseases are important to the ILO, and that's why I was, or rather, we were keen to make the comments in terms of the occupational diseases list, the mental aspects of the impact of the workplace to the workers has been identified and is an active area of attention. In terms of the second question, which I think activities related to workers in informal mining situations, unfortunately, the ILO does not have direct access to employers and working locations. We try through the fact that is a tripartite approach, the workers and the employers together working to develop the standards. Then through those organizations, the trade unions and the employer organizations, we try to promote the safety in all workplaces.
Okay, thank you very much, Tasos, for your presentation today and for attempting to come here. And we will move on to the next speaker. We have one more question, but maybe at the end of the session, we will have time to deal with that. Our next speaker today is Katerina Rovenska from SURO, from the Czech Republic, and also working with the EU RAP project. And Katerina will present today about radon at workplaces. What do European Union member states define in their radon action plans? I am pretty sure for the Europeans, this presentation is very, very important for all of us. So please, Katerina, the floor is yours, and please try to keep on time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jose Luis. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everything will be okay with my presentation, because I was having troubles to connect, and thanks to Mary that she will share the presentation. So let's start with the presentation. I would like to present you on behalf of my co-authors Ivana Fujtikova, Tanya Perko, and Mary Martel, the preliminary, and I would like to emphasize that these results are preliminary for our analysis of radon action plans. Next slide, please. So the objectives of the EU RAP study is to collect and review and assess in detail national radon action plans for all the EU member states and for the UK, according to the requirements of the Council Directive 59, actually the BSS directive, the abbreviation, and with a particular focus practical implementation of the actions defined by the Annex 18, and also to identify good practices to address the radon related issues together with experts, regulators, and local authorities and stakeholders from the EU member states and the UK, so they can share together the outcomes of their long work. Next slide, please. Up to now, we received 23 published radon action plans. Then we received information from 4 other member states that they are developing or drafting their radon action plans, and 2 countries decided not to develop the radon action plan at this stage because of the mostly of the local circumstances according to prevailing geology. So they prefer to collect data on radon concentration indoors before they started drafting. Next slide, please. And because the topic of this session is our workplaces, I would like to focus only on the item 3 and 4 of the Annex 18. And let me start with the results, preliminary results analyzing of the item 3. At the beginning, I would like to say that the questions or the data mining from the Radon Action Plans, we split in two parts, the strategy and the implementation part. And for this differentiation, we used also the flow chart for Radon Action Plans developed by the IAEA. So the basic questions for the item 3 are the whether we can find information regarding the identification of different types of workplaces where the radon measurement is required. Next slide, please. So for the results, the general workplaces where the radon measurement is required. Two countries, Malta and the Netherlands, are countries with quite low probability of having high radon concentration indoors due to prevailing geological bedrock, and they focus more on more or direct identification of houses and workplaces with elevated radon concentration. The rest of the countries specify which workplaces should be measured, and Luxembourg, for example, requires measurement of all of the workplaces, of every workplace before the end of 2028, which is quite interesting approach. Then the question was whether there are identified buildings with public access where radon measurements are required. Most of the countries require the measurement of public accessible buildings located on the priority areas. And some of the countries require measurement of workplaces located on specific types of bedrock, for example, in Finland. Regarding the identification of schools or kindergartens where the radon measurements is required, some of the countries do not differentiate between types of workplaces. So schools and buildings with public access are considered as workplaces, and they should be measured according to requirements given to workplaces. Some of the countries are more strict and require a measurement of all of the kindergartens and schools on their territory, for example, Croatia and Slovenia. They have a similar approach. Next slide, please. Regarding the implementation part of the of this item, we were seeking on recommendations or requirements for workplace measurement, a recommendation of for all of the types of workplaces, and then whether there are specific requirements or actions to be taken when the remedial action failed or is not that effective as expected, and the high radon levels indoors are remaining. And quite new situation delivered by the pandemic times. A lot of home offices were taken for last 2 years. So did the member states already implement home offices as a part of the workplace strategy, and whether the underground workplaces are defined in detail in the Radon Action Plans. Next slide, please. So to the results, whether there are some specific recommendations on the way to measure radon concentration in the workplace. It's quite closely connected to the another item of the Annex 18 for the general requirements for radon measurements. 7 countries mention that they usually require at least 2 months measurement conducted by integral radon detectors carried outside the summer season. 2 countries provide reference to the national methodologies for measurement, and 2 other countries state that the methodologies are under development. Quite similar is the situation for the buildings with public access and for schools. We are aware of this is quite specific question. So part of the countries for sure have this information somewhere else. They have for sure their national methodologies, but they probably didn't mention them in the Radon Action Plan, which is usually considered as a general document. Next slide, please. Regarding the actions to be taken after identification of high levels of radon at workplace, even after remediation, this element is, or this question is partly connected to the element 7 and 8 of the Annex 18. And some of the countries do not specify the procedure in the Radon Action Plan, and those who do have a similar approach to one provided by Estonia, which in short is if the reference level is exceeded, the employer is required to implement justified and optimal radon protection measures. And if after the implementation it is not possible to achieve the reference level, the monitoring of radiation should start immediately, and the workplace should be registered with the competent authority, which means that the monitoring of individual effective doses started, and that the other requirements given to the workplaces with elevated radon concentration should start. As I mentioned before, the pandemic times are quite new, and the radon action plans are usually developed and updated within 5 years round. So this quite new situation is not reflected in existing radon action plans, but probably in the next releases of the radon action plans, the work from home will be considered as well. Important question, especially in regards with the future implementation of new dose radon coefficients, is the definition of what are the underground workplaces, but only half of the countries specify the underground workplace in their radon action plans, and usually they comprise mines, caves, and all of the workplaces located underground. Next slide, please. And the next slides are dedicated to the element 4, which is connected to the reference levels for dwellings and workplaces. And in this part dealing with strategy, we were seeking for information regarding the basis for the establishment of reference levels. Next slide, please. The basis for the establishment of reference level is mentioned only in 2 radon action plans. Most of the countries implemented the reference levels given by the Council Directive, and the basis used by those 2 countries are the representative national survey of radon, indoor radon concentration. Again, what I mentioned before, this is quite specific and philosophical question, and not all of the member states probably mention that in their Radon Action Plan, which is usually available to public and might be too long and more dedicated to the professionals in radiation protection. Then we seek the information on the basis for the establishment of supporting levels, for example, target levels, action levels, design levels for habitable buildings, and so on. Few countries implemented these special levels, supporting levels to their reference level, but there were no more details given what is behind the level. Next slide, please.
You have 1 more minute, Katerina.
I will be so fast. Implementation, reference levels. Next slide, please. Almost all countries have 300 becquerels per meter cube. Only one country has 200, one country 100 becquerel per meter cube. Usually, the member states do not differentiate between workplaces, buildings with public access, and dwellings. And regarding the modification of reference level, there are no information regarding the implementation of new conversion factors. There are no information in the Radon Action Plans. And regarding the low occupancy workplaces, only single country have specific arrangements for low occupancy workplaces. Next slide, please. Education and training at workplaces. Most countries train architects, building industry, and remediation workers, but probably there is a gap for training courses for employees and employers. Next slides, these are just examples of communication towards professionals. Next slide, please. And also communication towards workplaces. Examples are from Ireland, Belgium, and Czech Republic. Next slide, please. And what are the next steps for us in the EU RAP consortium? We would like to organize several workshops, regional workshops for the member states to discuss in detail our analysis of their radon action plans and to clarify the gaps and the blank points. And I'm really thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to receive your questions. Thank you very much.
I take this opportunity, sorry, Jose Luis, may I take this opportunity as a member of this consortium also to thank the DG Energy, which is funding this study, but also to mention that we have a EU RAP reference group, and some of our members of this reference group are, for example, Olga and Rosa Bianca, who are with us today. So they give us feedback and they give us advice on how to move forward. Just this brief, point. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much.
We have a couple of questions, Katerina. I will ask you the questions and you can try to answer very, very fast. One comes from Melissa, and Melissa Murik, and she's asking about teachers and students in schools. If they are under legislation for workers' exposure. And Veti Denisa from Romania is asking if there are any mentions of fines to be applied if the guidelines are not followed. So can you try to reply this in 1 minute?
Thank you for the questions. Regarding the fines, it depends on the local legislation. If the fines are included in the national atomic law, for example, or the legal framework for the radon workplaces, then probably it is possible to get a fine for not following the rules. regarding the first question regarding the it was a limits for the workers, or could you please, Jose Luis, repeat the first question?
It's about if the teachers and students, I guess schools, if they are considering the legislation for workers' exposure.
It depends again on the local, on the national legal framework. If I can give you the example from the Czech Republic, teacher is a worker. Student is not considered as a student from the point of view of exposure, is considered as public. Student is considered as a worker with radiation only in case the radiation is used for the purpose, not from the point of view of radon.
Okay.
So the schools, if I may add, the school is partly workplace and partly the building with public access. So is it necessary to carefully read the national legislation, how it is dealt in detail. But it is very, very, very important, and it's not easy to find.
Okay. Thank you, Katerina. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Yeah, we can move on to the next speaker, Caroline from France, and she will talk about the challenges with the new implementation of the regulations of radon in the workplace and the French experience. So you have 12 minutes, Caroline, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose. Can you all see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to present you some feedback from France for the implementation of the French regulation. So first, the new regulation regarding radon. So I have a problem with seeing my slides. So this new regulation was issued in June 2018. And in fact, there were really willingness to have an integrated approach of occupational risk management and to consider radon as a potential workplace hazard to be managed according to the 9 general risk prevention principles who are set up in the labor code also, which are quite close to the principles presented by ILO previously. Sorry. So what are the workplaces concerned by this regulation? In fact, all workplaces which are located in the basement or ground floor of buildings, and also a set of specific workplaces. And there is an order which were published on the 30th of June this year, which precise which are these specific workplaces, like, for example, natural or artificial underground cavities, buried or partially buried ancient structures, any galleries or technical workshop in underground environments or places where groundwater resurgence occur. It is estimated that around 3.5 million workplaces would be concerned by this new regulation. The responsibility to implement this regulation and to implement occupational risk management falls on the employer, and but a graded approach has been adopted for the risk management. So if I go through the framework of this regulation, then we have the 9 general occupational risk prevention principles. We start with a risk assessment. This risk assessment can be done by a documentary analysis. I will come back to this. And if this documentary analysis, this analysis were able to show that there is no risk of exceeding the reference levels, then it is the end of the process. Otherwise, if there is a risk of exceeding the reference level, which is 300 becquerels per square meter, then it is necessary to implement radon measurements in the workplaces. This radon measurement then is compared with this level, the reference level, 300 becquerels per square meter. If yes, if we are below this level, then it is the end of the process. If we are above, then it is necessary to implement radon mitigation actions, including improvements of air tightness of buildings or air renewal. After implementation of these actions, there is a need to have again radon measurements in order to control the efficiency of the actions. And we will compare it again with this value of 300 becquerels per square meter. And if we are below, then end of the process. It is only if we are still above this level after the mitigation actions, then there is a need then to transmit the results of the measurements to IRSN, the technical support organization, and also to make a dose evaluation. And this dose evaluation will be done considering a full-time occupancy of the workplace. For the dose evaluation, the value then considered, the reference value, is 6 millisievert per year only due to radon exposure. If it is estimated that the individual dose would be below this value if the workplace were occupied full time, then there is still a need to continue the measurement of radon concentration of the area. We will have a radon monitoring, but that's all, if I can say. If there is a possibility that this value of 6 millisievert per year is exceeded, then it is necessary to delineate a radon area and to apply an enhanced framework for protection of workers. And in that case only, then the 3 principles of radiation protection will apply, like justification, optimization, and limitation. And it is a regulation for the ionizing radiation exposed workers that will apply. Then, who are the main stakeholders, in fact? Who are in charge of implementing this, first, elaborating the regulation and implementing it. At the level of the workplace regulation, we have, of course, the General Directorate of Labor from the Ministry of Labor on Employment. We will have also the labor inspectors, who will be in charge of controlling the implementation of the regulation, but also giving advice, and I will come back to this. Giving advice to the employers. We have IRSN, Institute of Radiation Safety and Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety, which is a technical support organization, which will be in charge of collecting the measurement data and also the exposure data if necessary. Then all the actors who are very important are all those who are in charge of occupational risk prevention. So we find the employers, of course, and also in the companies that may have occupational health and safety preventers. There are some organizations, national organizations, who can also provide advice, who are already set up to provide advice regarding health and safety for the majority of occupational risk, and that will have to integrate radon in this risk. So we have INRS, which is a reference body for occupational risk prevention in France, CARSAT, which is an organization from the Social Security, which provide advice to companies on prevention against occupational health disease and risk. We have also the occupational health services, and each employer needs to be affiliated to such a service, which include medical physicians and preventers. There are some private companies who can provide also risk prevention advice, and also an important actor, which is Social and Economic Committee, which is the committee with employee representative body. And then finally, all the stakeholders that we might encounter in implementation of this regulation are those in charge of who can provide advice about radon measurement and mitigation. So we will have the measurement devices providers and building professionals. And as said in the slide, you will see that this presentation is based on elements provided by interviews of people from DGT, IRSN, and CARSAT also. And Then, what is the issue with radon? In fact, is a new occupational risk for many companies. Companies that know the radon regulation are usually those that have a department of staff dedicated to regulatory monitoring. They already have to manage ionizing radiation presence, and they may have the presence of an RPO inside the company. And in fact, people from IRSN or even CARSAT told us that for them, currently the regulation is not known by most of employers. Then there is the first need to implement this regulation will be the need for awareness and information dissemination to companies and employers. And there is a role for this organization listed before involved in occupational risk prevention, for the occupational health services, who are in direct link also with workers themselves, and also the labor inspectors who are to provide, to control, but also advise. So these organizations already have starting the setup, the organization of specific workshops, webinars on integration or into occupational risk prevention training sessions. But what was pointed out is that there is also now first a need to train and inform the staff of this organization regarding radon risk and radon management, as this radon was not included before into occupational risk. Also, to foster the implementation of the regulation, we have the National Radon Action Plan, which doesn't define the regulation, but which gives some areas of strategic actions to be implemented. And regarding in France, regarding radon at workplace, it is mainly focused on information of employers and preventers, and focus actions also focused on the collection of data, of radon measurement data, and setting up a national database. And also what is interesting is that in the plan, we have a national plan on occupational health, and the next one, which will be published by the end of this year, should include also some specific actions regarding radon. Then it's also necessary to provide guidance and advice and maybe financial support. So that for employers, DGT and ASN published in 2020 comprehensive guide, practical guide, elaborated with a pluralist working group of 50 pages, explaining the regulation, and it is really a practical guide helping the employer step to step to implement the regulation on radon. INRS is also publishing information files, and many organizations progressively have some information support. And we can also have advice and support of companies at all stages, from the measurements to mitigations, and also when after there might be a need to consider the workers as exposed workers. We had this example of the CARSAT. They they support the companies that ask them for support from the beginning of measurements, then following mitigation and so on. But there is only one person available for large regions, so they will need in the future to find or to train other radon referents. Financial support can also be provided according to the size of the company. It will not be always needed. But some regional CARSAT provide already a specific financing support for small companies below 50 employees, and it can come until 50 kilo euros per company to be used for measurements, for diagnosis or remediation. And other CARSAT provides also financial support to prevent radon at the design building stage of new buildings. For example, financing support against radon, double flow ventilations, and so on. Then stakeholders' involvement, it has to be, it's very important, and it should be initiated at the level of the companies. It should be initiated as soon as the first measurement campaign is decided, in fact. not after measurements, but as soon as some dosimeters or some the devices to measure radon are put in the buildings in order to explain what's going on. So we need to include the managers, the employers, the managers, the staff representatives, the occupational physician, also the company prevention officers when they exist. And this involvement has to be renewed at each stages when there is measurements, when to publish the measurement results are published, if mitigation actions are undertaken, the results of these actions, and so on. Then in that case, we need, of course, to be prepared to answer questions raised by the workers, which is not so easy. And these questions could be, what is the health risk what is the health risk if concentration is above 300 becquerels per square meter? Or if a worker has spent 10 years or more in high radon concentration, what is his or her health risk? What will be the impact of working conditions if a radon area is set up, and so on. We may also have questions of compensation of occupational diseases that might be raised in some cases.
You have less than 1 minute, Caroline.
Okay, so a few issues regarding document analysis, not so easy in practice for the demonstration of no need for measurements. We can use IRS and radon mapping, possibility to consider radon measurements, but both have to be considered carefully. For the radon measurements, the self-measurement is possible, but which is good because it is more flexible and less expensive than application of a specific norm by accredited laboratories. But there are still issues and questions regarding the use of detectors, how to put them, and so on. We also, for the stage of radon diagnosis and remediation, we need to find building professionals, craftsmen. This is the same issue, in fact, than radon in dwellings, how to find this professional and to train them also. So those evaluation for the full-time occupied workplace, then the new order of with the new ICRP coefficient should be published by the end of this year, and questions will arise, notably on the equilibrium factor to be used according to workplaces and type of activities. And then managing radon area and individual worker exposure. There is this issue of individual dose estimate and recording. Which type of dosimeter should be used? Are there specific rules that had to be established for the national dose register systems? What issue for the workers who are already exposed with ionizing radiation and classified as category A or B? Then, as a matter of conclusion and perspectives, the objective of the French regulation was really a willingness to consider radon as an occupational risk to be managed within other occupational risks. And if no radon area is declared, there should be no need for management by preventers with radiation protection skills. However, this doesn't dispense with the need to raise awareness about radon for employers and workers, and the associated radiological risk and prevention reduction actions among actors in occupational risk prevention. The collection of experience feedback from the various stakeholders involved in the practical implementation of this regulation will be essential to evaluate its effectiveness, to adapt national action plans and/or regulation itself. There might be a challenge for integrating also specific regulation for the design and construction of new workplace buildings. And finally, it would be interesting in terms of sociology also to analyze if an increased radon awareness at workplaces would have an impact on the willingness to test or remediate radon at home for the workers. Then thank you for your listening. My acknowledgements to those people who accepted to give time for interviews to feed out our reflection. And in the slides that I think should be distributed, you will find after in an annex the regulatory text, the general principle of prevention, and a few references. Thank you for attention.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. We don't have time for questions, but maybe, Caroline, you can answer questions in the chat because you have 5 questions.
Okay, I'll do that.
That come from Olga German, from Cremena, Stephanie Hurst, Georgia Cinelli, and the last question to come from Alzveta Durekova. So please try to answer those questions in the chat. And we can move on to the last speaker today, Rosa Bianca Trevisi from Italy. So you have 12 minutes, Rosa Bianca, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, José Luis. Let me share the screen, my presentation. Please tell me if it's okay.
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, so thank you again. Good morning, everybody. Allow me to begin my presentation by thanking the organizing committee of RICOMET for the invitation. And my talk is about the Italian situation on the radiological protection on radon in workplace, focusing the attention mainly to societal aspect due to the title of this webinar. And I would like to focus in particular on the employer involvement and the workers' perception of radon risk. So the main question is, how can we face this societal aspect? And I found three principal tools, or three principal approach. By policy, by information and training campaign, by financial support for radon remediation. Before starting with the discussion, I would like to remind you that in Italy, the EU BSS has been transposed into the legislative decree 101 last year in 2020, a little bit late. And a dedicated chapter set out the provision on the protection from radon exposure in workplaces. And the legal requirements applied to identified workplaces, such as underground workplaces, ground floor and basement workplaces located in radon priority areas, in specific types of workplaces identified in the framework of the Italian Radon Action Plan, and in thermal spa. In Italy, the reference level for radon in workplaces is an average annual activity concentration of 300 becquerel per cubic meter. In this slide, I try to summarize the application of the graded approach to the protection from radon exposure at work in the Italian regulation. The flow chart is similar to the one reported in the figure 1 of the radiation protection 193, but obviously it's applied to the our national legislation. For all details, I'm here for giving you all details you are interested to know. But time it's not enough, for I would like to skip to the discussion about societal aspect, in particular point attention to policy. The lesson learned from the application of the previous national registration highlighted that it's very tricky to reach, to inform generic employers about provision given in radiological protection legislation. Typically, generic employers ignore, they don't know that they have to comply with provision given in radiological protection legislation. And maybe this is because their field of work usually is very far from the radiological protection culture, but they will know the regulation on health and safety at work. So, for an efficient and successful application of the new legislation, the transposition of the EU BSS allowed to strengthen the relationship between regulation on radon at work and the regulation on health and safety at work. And during the transposition process of the EU BSS, it was possible to update the regulation on occupational and safety, including radon in the list of occupational risk to consider during the risk assessment. So now radon is an hazard to consider in the risk assessment process. In this way, in Italy, it's possible to have an integrated system of protection of workers against all risk factors at work. Moreover, the new legislation addresses societal factors from two different points of view. They are an important element to take into account in the application of the principle of optimization of protection from radon exposure in workplaces. They are important together and with the economic aspect. But societal aspects are also an important topic in the view of the fact that the ubiquity of radon represents a challenge as for the radiation protection community, as for the occupational health and safety community. So this led me to go to consider the second approach. Focusing on the information and training tools. The awareness of radon risk and the of the provision given by the regulation about radon at work can be achieved by the information of the employees about radon, about its health effect, and including or with particular attention on its relation with tobacco smoke habits. And working on the training of employers. So the draft of the Italian Radon Action Plan foresees a general approach, a general strategy aimed to stimulate the stakeholders' engagement and to increase the risk perception of workers of radon risk and radon health effects. So in particular, in the draft of the Radon Action Plan, is provided, it foresees the introduction of basic training modules for employees in the program of the periodic refresher courses required by the health and safety laws. And these training activities is mainly provided for workers living and working in radon priority areas. Moreover, it is provided a program of training courses together with the training materials addressed to stakeholders, to various stakeholders, such as employers, undertakings, practitioners, and radiation protection professionals. So all these tools will be available. About the third approach, it is about the financial support for radon remediation. I would like to remind you that in Italy, there is a program for the improvement of health and safety in workplaces. Thanks to this program, it's possible to support those undertakings that promote action to improve health and safety in their workplaces beyond the legal obligation. Well, From last year, 2020, in the list of the occupational risk factor, including noise, vibration, chemical agents, biological agents, and so on, radon is included and is covered by the program. So in case of radon, undertakings can have a financial support if they found workplaces with a high level concentration, and if they remediate these workplaces, reaching radon concentration well below the reference standards and the reference level, sorry, and in particular below 200 becquerel per cubic meter. So this is according to the definition of the reference level and to the application of the principle of the optimization. This program allowed to promote action in those workplaces not included in the application field of the new regulation. So, for example, in those workplaces located out of the radon priority areas, but having high radon activity concentration. I don't know if it's late. I try to go.
You have 1 more minute,
okay.
Rosa Bianca.
Okay, so I'm ready for the conclusion. Sorry.
Perfect. Perfect.
In Italy, societal aspects connected with the protection from radon exposure in workplaces are taken into account by using 3 approaches. So by the regulation, by the policy, and in particular, the relationship between legislation on occupational health and safety at work and regulation on radon at work has been strengthened to have an integrated system of protection of workers against all the risk factors at work. The second, by using communication education campaign. So I would like to remind that in the framework of the Italian Radon Action Plan, some action will focus on the formation of employees and on the training of the employers and the other stakeholders. And finally, the financial support. As I told you, within a national program aimed to improve health and safety in workplaces beyond the legal obligation, undertakings can benefit from a financial support for the reduction of radon levels in their workplaces. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Rosa Bianca. So we are, I will say, exactly on time. It's a little bit later than 2:30. Yeah, so we maybe can have 5 minutes to conclude the webinar, and you can ask questions to the last speaker, or meanwhile, I think there was a question from the very beginning for the first speaker from Stephanie Hurst, and she was asking to Olga if you have information about countries and how the countries are taking the aspects that you have presented regarding workers into account in their radon action plans. So maybe or Tasos, you can also answer this question, maybe.
How workers are taken into account in radon action plans? Oh, sorry, I did
yes,
not really
do you have information if and how countries are taking the aspects you presented regarding workers into account in their radon action plans? Yeah, I think this is more a question for Tasos. It's about
he answered the question in the chat, but maybe
okay.
you can have a say, Tasos. Yeah,
I can read it out again because I cannot remember what I typed.
Okay.
The primary means by which the ILO oversees in inverted commas or collects information on what countries do and that covers all areas of worker protection, is through the reports that countries submit in relation to how they have implemented the Convention 115 that they have signed.
Okay, thank you, Tasos.
I can add a little bit. I have a feeling that there is a little bit over trust in the power of Radon Action Plans. A Radon Action Plan is a systematic approach to how you work. It is a document presenting how you systemize your work. But Radon Action Plan has no legal power over any employer. It is only regulatory documents and laws that govern the employers. Something that is stated in your Radon Action Plan can be totally ignored by any workplace. But if something is stated in regulation or in law, then they have to comply. And this is important to remember. And there's also a question we describe in Radon Action Plans, how to measure, where to measure, who has to measure, etc. But it is important to remember, employer is always responsible for all safety aspects at workplace, radon included. In this concerns, I would recommend to always look at this principle from the labor protection law. It is always employer who is responsible to measure, to remediate, to ensure safe working environment. And this is something we should always keep in mind.
Thank you very much, Olga. So at least from my side, I would like to say thank you again to the 5 speakers. Very, very good presentations today. And thank you also to the participants for all the questions. We don't have more time, but for sure we will have more occasions in the future to continue discussing. And we need to keep in mind that our goal is always to reduce the number of lung cancer due to radon exposure. So Mary, if you have something else to add, otherwise we can conclude.
Yeah, just would like to thank again the panelists, the attendees. We still have 80 people online, which is great for a Friday, a long week, I would say, at least for the RICOMET organizers. And this session was organized jointly with the IAEA. Thank you, Olga, for also drafting the program together with SHARE, the Network of Social Sciences and Humanities in Ionizing Radiation Research, the EURAP project, ERA. Of course, Jose Luis, thank you very much for your great moderation. It wasn't easy to keep the time, and more or less we have achieved that. The Radon project as well. And this is the last RICOMET session for this year. So videos are recorded. They will be uploaded in the SHARE website and RICOMET websites in the next week or so. And thank you again to everyone who is with us. And next year, RICOMET, just to announce, will be organized in Utrecht, together with the Norm 10 conference, the week of the 9th, from the 9th to the 13th of May. So we expect to see you, everyone there, face to face, hopefully, fingers crossed, and have a great weekend. Enjoy your holidays, Olga, and thank you very much. And all the rest, Tasos, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Rosa Bianca, Caroline, Katerina, Jose Luis.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye. Nice weekend.
Bye. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.